How are all of you? Good. Spoken like a pastor, huh? Once again, how are all you people out there? There we go. It's wonderful to be a part of this very important discussion and to welcome you all here to the U.S. Institute of Peace. And I do apologize that I'm going to have to sneak out at about 12:25 because of another commitment. And I'm grateful to my colleague, Steve Hadji, who is from the Rule of Law program here, a security sector reform specialist, but has also worked with faith communities, especially the Jesuits around the world in Africa and Latin America. So amongst my colleagues here at the Institute, he is not one of the ones who is afraid to participate in discussions with faith communities about issues of faith and religion. So thank you, Steve, for helping us out. Religion is a very powerful force in this world, both for destruction, for violence, as well as for peace and reconciliation and humanitarian response to disasters. That is in part why we have a religion program here at the U.S. Institute of Peace, where we work with religious actors and communities in conflict zones and try to support their efforts to promote reconciliation, to transform the drivers of violence, political and economic and social drivers of violence. My own personal work is with Buddhist and Christian communities and Muslim communities in Sri Lanka, in Myanmar, in Iraq, and in Colombia. Because of my work with many different faith communities, I am very excited today to be here with an interfaith panel to discuss the ways in which we can marshal the influence of religion, both ideas and institutions, in these efforts to address disarmament. It's the language and the values, as much as the institutions and the transnational networks, that religion lends to efforts to eradicate violence around the world. In the language of my own tradition, Protestant Christianity, it is God who calls us to dismantle the machineries of violence and war, and that compels us, that gives us the faith that these things are possible. We heard this morning a lot of the challenges that exist in terms of disarmament, and a lot of the challenges that exist in terms of the consequences of our not doing so. And so I think it's for these very reasons that we need to draw on faith, in order to draw from the deepest impulses within us, to have faith, to have hope that we can make a difference, and that in the end, the forces of death and violence will be defeated by the forces of life and love and justice. So we are going to hear from our four presenters, and then afterwards I'm going to invite all of you to offer any questions and answers you might have. We recognize that, as with any interfaith, multi-faith panel, not all religious traditions are represented here. So if there are those from other faith traditions or no faith traditions who also want to lend a brief offering of something from their faith tradition that is responsive to some of what you heard here, then please feel free to do so during that session as well. You have the bios of our four speakers in front of you, so I'm not going to yap on about that. But just to put faces to names, we'll hear first from Dr. Akemi Bailey-Haynie, who is from Sokogakai and serves as the National Women's Leader of SGI. She is a diversity trainer, consultant, and adult educator. On the far side here, we have Bill Barbieri, who is an associate professor at Catholic University, where he directs the Peace and Justice Studies program and teaches and writes on topics of issues of ethics, religion, and political theory. Next to Akemi, we have Mike Neuroth, who is an ordained minister in the United Church of Christ, a wonderful denomination in Protestant Christianity, my own, and serves in the Justice and Witness Ministries of the United Church of Christ in its Washington, D.C. office, where he works on issues of international peace, human rights, and economic justice. And then finally, we have Ibrahim Ramey, with the director of the National Office of Muslim American Citizens Coalition and Public Affairs Council, and has also worked with Fellowship on Reconciliation and the Temple of Understanding. So we're going to go in the order in which they're seated here. Thank you. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. I am truly honored, delighted, and so excited to be here this morning. And so from the bottom of my heart, I want to sincerely thank you for including me on this panel and in this conference together with so many of you who have been dedicating your lives to making this a more peaceful and secure world. I appreciate this wonderful opportunity to discuss the Soka Gakkai International USA's efforts to abolish nuclear weapons. My mother, Sachiko Takata Bailey, is a survivor of the atomic bombing of Hiroshima. At the age of 14, she experienced the catastrophic effects of the nuclear attack on Hiroshima and lost several very close family members. Even so, the shock, tragedy, and sorrow of that devastating incident didn't leave my mother bitter or hopeless. Instead, it launched her lifelong commitment to work for peace, to build a world where humans are treated with respect and humanity, a world free of nuclear weapons. My mother married a so-called enemy soldier who was African American and moved to the United States. It was in the so-called enemy's homeland that my mother found the teachings of Nichiren Buddhism, a philosophy that helped her weather the significant challenges associated with raising 7 biracial children in Gary, Indiana during the 1950s and 60s. As a foreigner who spoke little English, it is also a philosophy that enabled her to sustain hope and contribute to a more just and peaceful world. This morning, I'd like to share with you a bit of the history of SGI's nuclear abolition movement and give you an overview of our efforts today. The Soka Gakkai literally means Society for Value Creation, and it was built from the ashes of the post-war Japan. Second Soka Gakkai President Josei Toda, along with the founder of the Soka Gakkai, Sunatsubudo Makoguchi, were unjustly imprisoned during World War II for speaking out against Japanese militarist government and for refusing to recant their faith. Mr. Makoguchi died in prison of malnutrition, a martyr to his cause. From its earliest days, the Soka Gakkai leadership had witnessed and responded to abuse of governmental power that would lead its people toward a humanitarian disaster. The people of Japan suffered greatly because of the war. Mr. Toda dove into the suffering masses, teaching the growing number of Soka Gakkai members that the function of any religion or philosophy should be to provide people with the courage, optimism, and wisdom to transform their sufferings. But he also believed and shared with them that the concept of peace had broader implications than the mere absence of war. To achieve lasting peace required the deep-seated inner transformation of the individual. And this inner transformation would need to find expression in action, what we refer to as Soka or value creation. On September the 8th, Josei Toda made an historic declaration calling for the abolishment of nuclear weapons before some 50,000 Soka Gakkai youth in Yokohama, Japan. Mr. Toda denounced in strident language anyone who would use nuclear weapons and jeopardize people's fundamental right to live as a devil incarnate, a fiend, and a monster. Recalling that speech, SGI President Daisaku Ikeda, he wrote, Toda had the insight to understand that the logic that justifies the possession of nuclear weapons grows from the most extreme form of human desire, the desire to dominate and bend others to our will, the readiness to annihilate them, destroying their lives and livelihood should they resist. Mr. Toda's was a wake-up call that the potential evil that gave birth to nuclear weapons also existed in our hearts. It is only through an uncompromising struggle to win over our lesser selves and our own propensity to respond with violence that we are ultimately able to defeat the darkness that justifies the use of nuclear weapons. Let me give you an example. In one way or another, we all have annihilated others in our daily lives, in our homes, It takes the form of verbal, emotional, or physical abuse. At work, it can take the form of a dismissive attitude or disrespect for one's boss or colleagues. We even annihilate the environment with litter. Those same tendencies, when amplified, can escalate to bullying, aggressive behavior, violence, or unmitigated destruction. Ultimately, the use of passive or physical violence emanates from the same source as the justification for the use of nuclear weapons: the total disregard of all living beings, which begins in our hearts. Mr. Toda's declaration alerted us to the necessity of quelling the atomic bomb in our hearts in order to achieve the goal of preserving our inalienable right to live and the abolishment of nuclear weapons. Today, under the leadership of Daisaku Ikeda, the SGI is located in 192 territories and countries and has 12 million members. Our lay organization is involved on multiple fronts in the endeavor to abolish nuclear weapons. Dr. Ikeda has been a citizen diplomat for more than 40 years, engaging in dialogues with world leaders to bridge the gap among the world's people. Since 1983, he has published a total of 32 annual peace proposals, read by leading thinkers and United Nations officials around the globe, which address the diverse challenges global societies face. He has also written 2 environmental proposals and a proposal to empower the United Nations to live up to the world's expectations. In addition, in 2009, Dr. Ikeda authored a major treatise calling for global solidarity toward nuclear abolition and for the holding of a peace conference in Hiroshima Thank you. In this treatise, Dr. Ikeda wrote, "If nuclear weapons epitomize the forces that would divide and destroy the world, they can only be overcome by the solidarity of ordinary citizens, which transforms hope into the energy to create a new era." Further, he stated, "If we are to put the era of nuclear terror behind us, we must struggle against the real enemy. That enemy is not nuclear weapons per se, nor is it the states that possess or develop them. The real enemy that we must confront is the ways of thinking that justify nuclear weapons, the readiness to annihilate others when they are seen as a threat or as a hindrance to the realization of our objective." In line with Dr. Ikeda's endeavor, the SGI launched the People's Decade for Nuclear Abolition in 2007, in collaboration with international anti-nuclear movements such as the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, ICAN, and the International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear Weapons, WAR. The People's Decade is involved in a broad range of activities aimed at nuclear weapons abolition, including exhibits like the one you will see later today, petition drives, and public forums in which people of all ages exchange views freely, share ideas and experiences, and inspire one another. Each step, it fosters the process of transformation, ultimately swinging the tide in favor of the number of people who reject nuclear weapons. Our goal is fundamentally to make civil society the protagonist, creating a groundswell of demand for nuclear abolition that will influence decision makers. In September 2011, the youth of the SGI-USA launched a student-led dialogue campaign for nuclear abolition on college campuses across the nation. The campaign, which is called Our New Clear Future, has 2 main objectives. The first, to create a groundswell of public consensus toward nuclear abolition by 2015, when the next Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty Review Conference is due to be held. And the second, to achieve the complete abolition of nuclear weapons by 2030. Nationwide, the women of the SGI-USA, we are engaged in a proactive campaign to create harmonious families through prayer and dialogue. Because we recognize that peace begins in our homes, We believe that in order to have an impact on our communities and our nation, we must first heal our families. Because the future of the global family is at stake, the abolition of nuclear weapons cannot remain a mere ideal. The responsibility for the elimination of nuclear weapons lies with each of us here today, because home is where wars start and the place where peace begins. For the world's people to live in peace, the issue of nuclear weapons abolition is non-negotiable. We can create this new reality when awakened. People of faith and awakened people in power work in solidarity for the good of all humankind. It all begins with our willingness to engage in heart-to-heart dialogue. Dialogue starts from the courageous willingness to know and be known by others. It is a painstaking and persistent effort to remove all obstacles that obscure our common humanity. Genuine dialogue is a ceaseless and profound spiritual exertion that seeks to effect a fundamental human transformation in both ourselves and others. Dialogue challenges us to confront and transform the destructive impulses inherent in human life. I earnestly believe that the energy generated by this courageous effort can break the chains of resignation and apathy that binds the human heart, unleashing renewed confidence and vision for the future. In closing, the SGI believes the work of building a world without nuclear weapons signifies more than just the elimination of these horrific weapons. Rather, it is a process by which the people themselves, through their own effort, take on the challenge of realizing a new era of peace and creative coexistence. This is the necessary precondition for a sustainable global society, a world in which all people, above all, the members of our future generations, can live in the full enjoyment of their inherent dignity as human beings. From the bottom of my heart, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. As a Christian responding to that last presentation, I have to say amen. There's some beautiful sentiments there and a profound expression of SGI's response to nuclear weapons. Thank you so much for the invitation, Bill and SGI-USA and International, and to the U.S. Institute of Peace and Susie for hosting us today. Let's see, I think I have a PowerPoint presentation here. There we go. So I'm Michael Neuroth with the United Church of Christ, Justice and Witness Ministries. It's interesting, you mentioned 1957 as kind of an auspicious moment in your tradition. And for the United Church of Christ, we were founded in 1957 as a unification of several different Christian strands, which I'll be speaking about a bit today. So it strikes me at the same time that José Toda made his declaration on nuclear weapons, in Cleveland, Ohio, the United Church of Christ was founded that same year. Being founded in 1957 gives us kind of a unique opportunity to say that almost from our very inception, the UCC has been a tradition that has opposed nuclear weapons on theological, moral, and humanitarian grounds. The United Church of Christ General Synod in 1959, 2 years after our founding, in the resolution, A Call to Christian Action in Society, called for effective international control and reduction of all national armaments, including the testing of nuclear weapons. Precisely in response to the crisis of nuclear weapons and the humanitarian impact, the UCC has over the years shifted its approaches to war and not only articulates a clear opposition to such weapons, but now, because of the struggle that nuclear weapons presents, embraces a deeper paradigm of active peacemaking, which I'll be speaking about as well today. As a uniting church, the UCC inherited the theological and ethical traditions of several other traditions, which have given it, I believe, a very unique and prophetic character on many issues, and particularly on nuclear weapons. Our opposition to nuclear weapons has increasingly developed through our historic partnership with the German church, from which many of our historically evangelical and reformed U.S. congregations trace their lineage. And secondly, through our relationship with the people of the Marshall Islands, which was also a historic relationship that began as a missionary effort by early Congregationalists. I think it's important, the topic for the panel for us to respond to today was how do we see the humanitarian impact of nuclear weapons? And I think it's clear from our tradition that how we see the issue really comes through the lens of our partners. And I think that hopefully what you take from this presentation is that, as we saw this morning, any nuclear attack will transcend national boundaries. And thus, I believe, and the UCC tradition has articulated, that our response must also transcend national boundaries. The passage I put up here is one that I think is profound for us to reflect on, and I think begins to unravel the myth of redemptive violence that too often religion is used to justify wars, and particularly nuclear weapons. The United Church of Christ Congregational in the Marshall Islands has a long-standing partnership and roots with the United Church of Christ as an historic mission activity dating back to 1857, when the then American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions, which was the first ever missionary organization here in the U.S., established Congregationalist churches from across the islands. They were part of the UCC when it was founded in 1957 and became an independent church in 1972. It is, by the way, one of the largest religious groups in the Marshall Islands. UCC has maintained this relationship through the years, including contact with Arab, the network of nuclear testing survivors. Arab, as you can see up there, means shattered or broken in Marshallese language. It stands for the 4 atolls that were mostly affected. And I will not try to pronounce them, but you see them there. Because of this historic relationship, the UCC through the years has passed several resolutions in support of the Marshallese, calling for reparations and the end of nuclear testing and weapons. It also relates to the UCC's historic contribution to environmental justice, which linked the dumping of toxic waste with people of color. And I would add in more recent years, the impact of nuclear weapons and that generally climate change has on the Pacific Islands also has shaped our positions on environmental issues and climate change. Between 1946 and 1958, 67 nuclear bombs were tested in the Marshall Islands, leaving a devastating impact on the livelihoods of almost everyone. I could have put pictures of that devastation, but I know that for many of you, those images are quite familiar. And what I wanted to present today was more the images of hope. I've had the chance to work with some of the survivors, and specifically Mrs. Lemio Aban, retired teacher and Marshallese elder who I got to accompany in meetings on Capitol Hill, raising the issues of nuclear fallout on Rongelap and the individual, family, and community health impact from radiation. When I spent time with Lemio, she spoke specifically of impact on women and mothers, and specifically the stories of women giving birth to babies which have come to be known as jellyfish babies, which some of you may have heard this notion, but that essentially the babies are born without bones. And this is a new phenomenon that's happened in their society following the nuclear testing. The U.S. denies that such miscarriages, sterility, and congenital birth defects are the result of these exposures. And as Ms. Aban said in a 2012 human rights meeting on the topic, and the quote is up here at the top, "We gave the world knowledge of the many ways that radiation can destroy a human being. Yet today we see our cultural ways of life sorely affected by the loss of our beloved homes and our people plagued by the illness caused by radiation. Our experience is that nuclear fallout creates damages that endure and expand. Yet the U.S. assistance programs continue to contract and deny." Again, as was mentioned this morning, the need to ratify the CTBT is all but clear from this example. The relationship with the Marshallese has opened the eyes and ears of many UCC members to the impact of nuclear weapons. And in 2001, we passed a resolution of ministry and witness with Micronesians that formally apologized to our complicity. This is something that the faith community adds to this discussion. It's this notion of confession and forgiveness. It said, "We confess our silent complicity as the United States citizens perpetrating nuclear poisoning and economic exploitation of the people and environment of Micronesia. We extend our heartfelt and formal apologies for these. In addition to our partnership with the Marshall Islands, we have another interesting partnership that has both emerged from and been inspired around collaboration on nuclear weapons. In 1981, the United Church of Christ General Synod declared a formal relationship of full communion called Kirchengemeinschaft with the Evangelical Church of the Union in Germany. The EKU was a historic union of the Lutheran and Reformed traditions in Germany and the ancestral church of many German-American pioneers who founded the Evangelical Synod in the U.S., one of the UCC's antecedent traditions. What I think is important to emphasize today is how this encounter and engagement specifically focused on nuclear weapons. That even though the UCC had historic ties to the German church, it was in the mid-'80s that this partnership came to fruition in terms of a full communion with one another. And that discussion and engagement really was focused around the crisis of nuclear weapons. In 1984, the Protestant churches in West Germany were deeply divided over the issue of American Pershing and cruise missiles targeting East Germany from U.S. military bases on West German territory. I think it's valuable to point out the fact that our partnership extended to both East Germany and West Germany, that in part our partnerships helped bridge some of the dialogues across that divide. But engaging in shared threats, hopes, and solutions inspired both communities toward the fundamental change needed, recognizing that just war was not adequate in a nuclear age and the Cold War situation. And that has inspired what has become one of the UCC's identity. As you know, from within many of our traditions, or have a deep connection to the just war tradition. In 1985, the United Church of Christ declared itself a just peace tradition, essentially articulating a space between crusades, between just war and pacifism, that recognizing that just war was no longer adequate given the current situation we were in, largely in the Cold War era, and the reality of the challenge of nuclear weapons, and that a different way was needed. The 15th General Synod affirmed just peace as the presence and interrelation of friendship, justice, and common security from violence. The Synod affirmed the following as the marks of a just peace theology: that peace is possible. The international structures of friendship, justice, and common security from violence are necessary and possible at this point in history in order to eliminate the institution of war and move toward a just peace. The concept, I think, not only of the practices of just peace that have been articulated in subsequent years that U.S. Institute of Peace and other organizations have connected with, but the theological grounding for the just peace position really was based around the concept of shalom, which we don't have time to go into today, but I think it points to the challenge of the humanitarian impact that nuclear weapons have and the unacceptability that we see of their use. Susie challenged us to think within our tradition of the voices not only that are opposed to nuclear weapons, but maybe the voices that challenge that position within our own traditions. And so I've lifted up to you two very different voices. Reinhold Niebuhr also traces his roots to the United Church of Christ, to the German Reformed Church. And some of you may know William Sloane Coffin. I can read their quotes up here. But the point being is that many times the Christian realism of Niebuhr is held up as justification. A lot of times he is pulled tug of war between liberals and conservatives around these issues to justify their positions. He gained his work gained some notoriety just a few years ago when President Obama identified him as one of his most personal, influential philosophers. But then within the United Church of Christ, we also have the legacy of William Sloane Coffin, who I know was deeply involved with the St. Freeze movement. So you have this question of the acknowledgement of kind of the Niebuhrian position of using evil to prevent greater evil on the one hand, versus Sloan Coffin's opposition that this never can be justified. And I thought it was interesting this morning in response to the presentation from the State Department, I heard over and over the question of it's very complicated, it's very hard. And one of the other quotes that I thought about putting up here from William Sloane Coffin was one that says, "We are beginning to resemble extinct dinosaurs who suffered from too much armor and too little brain." That is the challenge that we face, and that's what I'll end with this morning. Thank you.
Good morning, all. Good morning. With the name of God, most beneficent, most merciful, God's blessings of peace and justice to all here. Nam Myoho Renge Kyo, to my friends from SGI. I want to first of all say that I'm going to try to truncate what would have been a longer presentation and was evolving into a paper, and then of course I had to submit to the reality of time limitations, so I won't bore you with what would have been a very kind of amateurish sort of PowerPoint presentation. But I do want to say that I'm really deeply honored by the invitation I received from my dear friend and colleague Hiro Sakurai, and also from my dear friend and colleague Bill Aiken. And it's an honor to be here before you, to witness the importance, the centrality of the ongoing work of SGI as a leader in the global faith community, advocating the elimination of nuclear weapons and the spiritual transformation and evolution of human society that will evidence that transformation. I also want to say that the fact that we are here some 69 years after the horrific bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki should give evidence of the fact that we are not living in an age of great scientific enlightenment, and in fact, the boundaries of secular science have taken us to a place very close to the brink of oblivion. As I consider what has been said already in this conference, I realize that we are faced with a dilemma, and that is whether we fit the moral boundaries of peace and justice within the pragmatic, quote-unquote, frameworks of international law and diplomacy, or whether, conversely, international law and diplomacy needs to be within the framework of morality and what we would call in the Abrahamic traditions God consciousness, or taqwa, if one is speaking of Islam. So I think that the question becomes for us, which way do we turn? Do we submit only to the now, or do we imagine a future in which morality and true human solidarity and love might be the norms within which our political and geopolitical considerations are fit? Now, I'm also aware that there are many friends here who've had much more interesting narratives and journeys through the process of becoming anti-nuclear activist. I see my friend Alan Ware, who pops up everywhere from New Zealand to New York to New Bedford, Massachusetts, or any other place I can think of anew. And I just want to say and witness the fact that while there may be an intellectual process that brings us to this, or even a spiritually discerning process that brings us to this position, mine started with a discussion of this word called Trinity. Now, people who are aware of nuclear history will understand and remember that Trinity was the code name for the first explosion of a nuclear device in the Manhattan Project prior to the actual detonation of the nuclear weapons over Hiroshima and Nagasaki. When I sat down with my mom and my daddy and my Aunt Lula in an African-American working class family in Norfolk, Virginia, around the age of 9, if we mentioned the word Trinity, it would have had to do with the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost. However, the trinity of their experience, which was not informed by science or deep interrogations of national policy, essentially said, as I recollect the conversations, that nuclear weapons were just bad. They were wrong. It was wrong for the United States to detonate these weapons. It was wrong to engage in the mass slaughter of civilians in Japan. And mind you, these were not people, and I did not come from people who had what would be called a sophisticated worldview around these things, but they were people who had a fundamental understanding of right and wrong. And when we return to the issue of the understanding of right and wrong, we come to the fact that there is something in the human heart that transcends science, it transcends policy, it transcends the intellectual conversations, if you will, around nuclear weapons, that essentially says for all thinking and believing people that it is simply wrong to build, to deploy, to use, or to threaten to use these weapons of mass destruction. It is simply wrong, and that every other consideration has to be fit within the framework of the moral judgment that says that this is wrong. Now, of course, later on, I was able to develop a more studied understanding of the process. I was invited to visit North Korea in 1990, I believe. For 11 years, I directed disarmament work at the National Fellowship of Reconciliation. That enabled me to do some rather interesting things, like get arrested at nuclear weapon sites and witness at other places in the United States, to eventually take a delegation to Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1995, and to, through the guidance of other people who are certainly leaders in this movement, to develop a moral framework that was even more detailed. But what essentially happens as we think about these issues is that we have to go back to the fundamental question of right and wrong that is so brilliantly articulated by SGI and its leadership. Now, because I've been asked to actually talk about Islam in the context of nuclear weapons and nuclear weapons abolition, I realize that more than any other faith tradition alive right now, Islam is at a focal point of global interrogation. I think that is something that is good. I think that is something that's necessary and understandable. Why? Because of the configuration of international terrorism, of different threats by non-state actors to world peace and so on. I think it is important, however, that people who have a question about this also understand that there are both scriptural and exegetical roots of disarmament and the likelihood of the rejection of nuclear weapons in this particular tradition. I begin by, first of all, pointing out that in the Quran, the revelation that Muslims believe is the word of God coming to Prophet Muhammad, there is a ayat or a verse in the second chapter that says the purpose of human life, the purpose of humankind, is to witness that we are here in this earth to be the vice-regents or protectors of the natural order. From there, we can look at other verses in the Quran that talk about the proscription of war. That is, war is not absolutely abolished, but the limits of warfare are clearly defined both scripturally and morally. It is compulsive or a matter of compelling interest that Muslims believe that if you do engage in armed conflict, that there are ways to reach accord and reconciliation with those with whom you are in conflict, that we are called upon to generally abstain from any kind of warfare that would destroy the natural environment, including trees and plant life and animal life, and that in a more contemporary sense, there have been Muslim leaders who have, although they're not very prominent voices necessarily, have raised the whole question of nuclear conflict and the possession of nuclear weapons. For example, I'll just point out a couple of them. One was a statement from the World Muslim Congress in 1984 that said, and I quote, where is it? There is no room in Islam for indiscriminate killing and destruction. Muslims must be uncompromisingly opposed to such barbaric instruments of death, meaning nuclear weapons. In a similar vein, one of the Ayatollahs, Ayatollah Khomeini, in 2012, was quoted as saying that we, meaning the Islamic Republic of Iran, are not interested in developing nuclear supremacy. We do not believe that nuclear weapons can bring this supremacy. In a more contemporary way, here and closer to home, we have seen work done by the Islamic Society of North America and my own former organization, the Muslim American Society Freedom Foundation. MAS had sponsored a small but I think fairly significant development in that, to my knowledge, we were the first Muslim organization in 2008, I believe, to have a hearing on Capitol Hill in which we invited nuclear disarmament experts from other traditions as well as ethicists from Islam to talk about the impermissibility, if you will, of nuclear weapons and how the Muslim American community needed to play a leading role in the abolition efforts surrounding nuclear weapons. I think it's very important also to say right now that part of the challenge, if you will, confronting Islam globally is the idea that we cannot dichotomize morally the understanding that it's okay for some countries to have nuclear weapons and not okay for others to have it. I believe that nuclear weapons are a bad idea for all of humanity. I believe, frankly, that nuclear power, as we can see from the results of Fukushima, is a bad idea in its totality for all of humanity. But we cannot pretend to say that it's bad for some countries to have a program that may be creating fissionable material and ultimately atomic weapons, and okay to ignore the fact that the major nuclear power in the Middle East is an unspoken reality that, frankly, the policymakers of the United States would prefer that all of us forget. But frankly, if we do take a position, and it is necessary to take a position on nuclear weapons, I believe it needs to be a universal position. And frankly, I would like to conclude briefly with 5 points of commonality and hopefully discourse that might lead the Muslim community and globally and here in the United States to pursue this. The first thing is that a practical solution would be to take Dr. Cantor's position, dub it in Arabic and Farsi, and get it out. Because I think that what we saw earlier today was an absolutely clear, empirically provable argument that nuclear weapons, as they are exploded, would be an absolute disaster for all human beings, and particularly the people that are in some kind of conflict within what we call the Middle East. I think it's also important to say right now that it is not simply the production of nuclear weapons, but the entire cycle of the extraction of uranium and the processing of uranium and the creation of fissile material and so on, that is really a danger to all of humankind. We've talked about, thank you very much for doing it, the condition of the Marshallese people after so many nuclear tests in the Marshall Islands, but we have not yet mentioned the Shoshone people and other indigenous people here in the United States who continue to suffer from not only the mining and extraction of uranium on their indigenous land, but also the hazard of storing nuclear waste on this land. So it's important that we understand that it's not simply a crime to manufacture the weapons and use them. It is a crime to do all of the things required in the life cycle of fissile material production that would lead to the possibility of nuclear weapons. So let me get back to my list, if I may. And again, this is going to be a little bit truncated, but I want to try to make a few points, if I may, at the end. The first thing I think is that we should try to make the conversation about nuclear abolition more central in the discourse within the Islamic tradition as well as within other faith traditions. There are plenty of intellectual and moral leaders who have raised these points, but they have not yet gotten to the centers of power where the decisions around statecraft and war making and military budgets are made. And I think that for those who believe in God and believe in a particular tradition, it is important to bring these conversations more into centrality. The second point I'd like to make is that we, as Muslims, and this is a self-critical point, need to look at nuclear abolition not within the framework of an anti-Western or anti-imperial posture, but rather a humanitarian posture that affirms the essential teachings of Quran and Hadith, which are also affirmed in the Gospel of Jesus and the Old Testament. So that it is not simply a matter of political expediency that others are saying don't have a nuclear program. It is because these things are bad intrinsically for all of humankind that Muslims would seek to abolish nuclear weapons. The third thing I'd like to mention is that we do need to bring the narrative stories of the victims of nuclear testing into some discourse. So I would say that if it is possible for institutes like USIP to do this, it would be great to have nuclear scientists from Iran, nuclear scientists from Pakistan, and the people from the Marshall Islands, the Western Shoshone, and others who have been actually affected by the nuclear history of this planet. So I would suggest that that is something that could be done and that should be done, because I believe that the stories of those, as well as the Hibakusha of Japan, are compelling. They reach the heart in a way that simple scientific discourse cannot. And so let's begin to recognize the moral core of the argument and bring all of those together who are stakeholders in building a nuclear future. I also think that it's important, frankly, stop, okay. It's important, okay. Can I finish the sentence? Okay, it's important, frankly, to understand that we are living right now in an age where, as Dr. King said, it is not a matter in the nuclear sense of abolition or non-abolition. It's a matter of existence versus non-existence. I thank all of you for being here. I ask God's blessings upon all of you. I realize we have very significant work to do in this country and globally. I believe we can get it done. Thank you, Soka Gakkai International, for pointing the way. Nam Yoho Renge-kyo. Assalamu alaikum.
You taking off? Okay. As a slightly buttoned-down Catholic, when I say good morning and greetings to everyone, I don't expect a response. You don't have to say anything. Today is Take Your Kid to Work Day, today my kid's school. And I have to say that I'm glad I didn't give in to my child's request to bring him to work today, because it was a pretty scary presentation that we had this morning. Although I did notice that Andrew Cantor did manage to bring his own child to work in spirit today. And I think it's important that we have the image of our children in mind as we address these topics today. I want to give my thanks, add my thanks to those of my colleagues here, to Soka Gakkai International, also to the U.S. Institute of Peace for hosting this event today. I'm very pleased to have the opportunity to discuss with my colleagues here, with all of you, these questions about the humanitarian impact of nuclear weapons. Especially thankful to Ibrahim for not bringing a PowerPoint presentation, because I don't have one either. I do have some remarks that begin with a quote from a document, the 50th anniversary of which we commemorated last year, namely the great encyclical letter of John the 23rd, Pacem in Terris, in which the pontiff said, nuclear weapons must be banned. As simple as that. Everyone, however, must realize that unless this process of disarmament be thoroughgoing and complete and reach men's very souls, it is impossible to stop the arms race or to reduce armaments or, and this is the main thing, ultimately to abolish them entirely. Again, for the process of disarmament to be thoroughgoing and complete, it must reach men's very souls. Women too, we'd have to add now. So how do we get there? How has the Catholic Church's views evolved on this topic? I want to do three things in my remarks. The first is to give a bit of a historical tracing of the emergence of a broad ethical consensus, one that unites the just war and nonviolent strands of the Catholic community in support of nuclear abolitionism. My second goal is simply to provide a brief inventory of how principles of Catholic social teaching see and support the case for abolitionism. And finally, time permitting, I may be able to devote a few words to the shape of a Catholic abolitionist agenda, although I may simply punt and leave that up to my colleague Marie Dennis, who is tasked with that topic this afternoon. From a Catholic standpoint, the ethics of nuclear policy have addressed three major questions in turn: the morality of the use of nuclear weapons, the morality of deterrence as a policy toward nuclear weapons, and finally, the morality of the simple possession of nuclear weapons. The most basic qualms about nukes and their prospective use are readily summarized. On the first question, one needn't invoke the prospect of Armageddon or nuclear winter. One needn't invoke the data that we saw this morning in order to rule out the use of nuclear weapons, since these violate key principles of even a modest theory of just war, which has been the historical basis of the Catholic reasoning about war, namely the principle of, or the criteria of proportionality, first of all, and secondly, discrimination, or as it's more widely known, perhaps non-combatant immunity. Nuclear weapons obviously violate both of these principles, and the testimony we've heard today and that was presented at Oslo and in Mexico only serves to underscore the particular case about proportionality and the fact that the use of nuclear weapons and the great ills that it brings with it can never be justified by, or balanced out by proportionate goods. In terms of loss of life, economic harm, nuclear famine, and ecological destruction, all of these vastly outweigh any goods that a nuclear exchange might be thought to promote. Now, the Church moved from its early rejection of the use of nuclear weapons to a discussion in the 80s of nuclear deterrence. On the issue of deterrence, the chief ethical obstacle is this: in order to be credible and hence viable, a deterrence policy must rely on an actual intention to use nuclear weapons should certain circumstances arise. Because in ethics, an immoral intention is sufficient to invalidate an act, this is a Thomistic point, deterrence understood as constituting a murderous threat is a culpably immoral policy, quite apart from any beneficial consequences it might produce. Now, these ethical judgments are, as I say, readily outlined, but they're hardly incontestable, and there are arguably plausible grounds for suggesting either that there could conceivably be forms of nuclear weapons whose applications might be surgical enough to meet so-called just war criteria, or that we might still recognize that there's enough of a moral difference between the threat of the use of nuclear weapons and the actual use to provide the basis for some sort of limited ethical defense of deterrence. The U.S. Catholic bishops tried out this type of argument in their 1983 pastoral letter, The Challenge of Peace, where they accepted, finally, a kind of limited conception of deterrence. This acceptance was admittedly uncomfortable, and as some bishops later allowed, grudging. And after stating fairly definitively that the use of nuclear weapons was immoral, the bishops nonetheless provided a strictly conditional moral acceptance of deterrence, with the proviso that no arms race be tolerated and that the policy be a temporary stage on the path to disarmament. That was the key restriction. Now, leaving aside the arguments against the coherence of this position, it seems fairly clear that in the meantime, the kind of already but not yet provisional acceptance of deterrence that the bishops acceded to has in the intervening decades effectively expired. And as it became clear that the security policies of major powers, including the U.S., tended not only to produce not to produce decisive movement toward abolition, but indeed moved toward developing capacities for limited nuclear warfighting, statements began to emerge both from the U.S. bishops and from the Holy See, suggesting that the conditions that had supported their earlier reluctant tolerance for deterrence no longer obtained. Now, continuing with my history, this development occurred within a broader move within Catholic thought and the Catholic community, spurred by John Paul II's sensibilities and the series of nonviolent regime changes around the world at the end of the 80s that collectively contributed to a rise in the stock of nonviolence as a Christian stance. For Catholic pacifists, be they Pax Christi activists or practitioners of civil disobedience of the plowshares sort, nuclear weapons and deterrence had always been non-starters that couldn't be reconciled with a prophetic witness to the solidarity and peace of the body of Christ. At this point, something of a convergence has occurred around the view that a renewed push for disarmament must be the focus of Catholic teaching and action on nuclear weapons. It's also taken shape against the backdrop of a broad shift from a just war ethic to what some commentators, myself included, have called modern peace ethics as the public stance of the Church on violence, a public commitment that approaches something like Michael's just peace ethic that he outlined. At present, the Catholic Church's position is solidifying around a judgment that in the wake of an unstable and crumbling structure of deterrence, not just the use or threat, but even the very possession of nuclear weapons has become morally insupportable. The humanitarian implications of maintaining a fleet of nuclear weapons here make common cause, with a deepening awareness of, on the one hand, the ecological ramifications of such programs. There's a burgeoning ecological consciousness in the Catholic community now, and at the same time, a solidifying doctrine of what the Church calls authentic human development. All of these militate against the maintenance of very expensive nuclear arsenals. So that's where we stand now. I want to just give a brief inventory or sketch of how Catholic principles of Catholic social teaching, this over 100-year tradition now that's been issued in teaching documents of the Church, how these principles bear on and in fact support a stance of abolition. And in fact, once you look at the range of these principles and precepts, it's actually harder to find principles that don't contribute to and support an abolitionist stance than it is ones that do. So I'm just going to give a quick mention of 10 different principles or precepts that play a significant role in Catholic social thought and indicate how they bear on this question of the humanitarian impact of nuclear weapons and nuclear weapons more generally. I'll be happy to elaborate on any of these points in our discussion. First of all, a key idea, a key commitment that's emerged from the traditional Catholic notion of the common good in the post-World War II period is the idea of the global common good. And it's clear that the global common good is undermined by a system that encourages nations to aspire to control of nuclear weapons by increasing the chance of accidents, malfunctions, and the deliberate use of weapons. Let's see, that's one. Next up, I don't think I have to say much more about the fact that nuclear weapons, their use, even their possession, constitute threats to the life and dignity of persons, another cardinal principle of Catholic teaching. Next up, we have canons of justice here. And we can break down the idea of justice, as Catholic ethicists are wont to do, into commutative justice, distributive justice, social justice. All of these varieties of justice are threatened in different ways by the current nuclear regime. Next up, we have the option for the poor. And one topic that we haven't addressed very much here is how the possession of nuclear weapons and the maintenance of nuclear weapons and the resources that go into that detract from efforts to address extreme poverty and other social problems. And that's become a very live issue for the church. Participation, the conditions that enable the participation even of the poorest members of society in determining the course of society, this too is a value that seems to be excluded by our current system of nuclear weapons. Human rights. The Catholic commitment to human rights that emerged in the same document I quoted, again identifies several points at which the maintenance of nuclear weapons challenges the protection of human dignity. Let's see, we have a few more. A couple of them bear on this ecological consciousness that I mentioned as emerging in Catholic teaching and Catholic action now. The notion of the universal destination of the earth's goods is a fundament of that ecological consciousness. And also what the U.S. bishops call the care of creation, or what others might call the principle of sustainability. I think, again, the evidence from this morning showed the threats to sustainability that nuclear weapons represent through either their use or, again, simply their possession. Solidarity is a key social principle of Catholic social thought. And again, this is at odds with the mindset that is expressed in the maintenance of our current structure of deterrence. Finally, we have a set of threats to authentic human development. Some folks who are working on this issue have put these in terms of the Millennium Development Goals, but it's clear that Catholic efforts to build up a model of development that is not simply an economic development, but embraces the whole human spirit, that this, again, is at odds with the continued maintenance of the current nuclear system. So I want to, I'm pretty much out of time. I'm not going to spend much time on the way that the Catholic Church plans to move ahead with this. One point that I do want to make, though, is that the Vatican itself has been able to play a role as a state power, as a sovereign entity, as a player in some of the international movements that address nuclear issues and meetings. So Vatican diplomacy can be one element of an emerging Catholic abolitionism. At present, there's a process in place in the Vatican that is involving the emerging character of Pope Francis's new approach to Catholic teaching in the world. And I simply want to hold him up, in part because he is, I think, presiding over a process that is going to go public in the not-too-distant future as endorsing a strong stance against nuclear weapons, but also because he, to return to my initial quote, is someone who I think lives out and manifests to others the disarmament of the human soul that was envisioned by that document back in the 60s. So I'll close with that thought and look forward to our discussion. Thank you very much.
Conscious of our time, I think we should just take a first round of questions, unless there are any issues that the panelists would like to respond to their colleagues on before we move. Okay. Why don't we have about 17 minutes then for discussions before this session is scheduled to conclude. So maybe we take our first one. Great, thank you.
Mr. Hunter, if you have a question or a comment, you can go to one of the microphones and line up in one of the microphones.
Thanks. Sorry for taking the floor again, but I was very interested in the comments of the relationship with the Marshall Islands, particularly as today the Marshall Islands has lodged a case in the International Court of Justice against the nuclear-armed states, which will be a very interesting case, and I think will help elevate again not just the humanitarian impact of nuclear weapons, but also the legal issues that are very important to help move the nuclear weapon states to meet their obligations. The Marshall Islands was very instrumental in the 1996 case and in the determination by the International Court of Justice that the destructive effects of nuclear weapons cannot be contained in time or space. My question, therefore, is in relation to the joint statement that I think is coming out of this meeting, and where it talks about the key opportunities for moving forward. It's related very much to the Non-Proliferation Treaty. And while that's a good basis to start from, I don't think it's sufficient, because you have some of the nuclear armed states are not even members of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. And if you have a look at the decision from the International Court of Justice in 1996, it didn't say that the obligation for nuclear disarmament was only on the states parties to the NPT. It said that it was a universal obligation. And I think that the statement should really reflect that and not just be based on the NPT, but should look at the opportunities arising out of the universal obligation for nuclear disarmament and the opportunities that arise for that in the different fora, including the NPT, but not constrained just to the NPT, including in the International Court of Justice, the UN General Assembly, the UN Secretary General's 5-point plan, etc. I'm wondering what the panel thinks about that. Thank you.
Mike, you go first.
It's a good question. And I may defer to colleagues here who've been working on the issue for longer. I think that for us, what I hope to lift up in my presentation really is that our position and approach has been one that has been developed in the process of accompaniment, solidarity, and really walking with the Marshallese. And that has happened, that has inspired our response. And so I certainly would support a stronger statement looking not only at the NPT, but also kind of the ways in which international law can have a firmer application to the issue of nuclear weapons and nuclear testing.
Thank you very much for your comments, Alan. I think that generally there, not to bifurcate the discussion, but I think that there are two parts of what I think would be an ethical way of looking at it. One would be the recognition of the need for reparations particularly for communities that have been egregiously affected by nuclear testing or other aspects of the nuclear production cycle. The second would be within the framework of the NPT, particularly looking at Article 6. And I think it's important to say right now that we cannot look at nuclear weapons as simply being theoretical things that may at some point in the future be exploded. They have been used in warfare. They were directed and developed by American science. They were used against two civilian populations in the prosecution of war in 1945 by the United States of America. And I do believe that while America is not unilaterally responsible for abolition, that there is a specific and very real central commitment that the United States of America needs to make in both the reparations aspect of the question and also in the continuation of the call for a nuclear weapons convention that I think has really not been a central issue that we've discussed today. So, my remarks.
Alan, I think that, in conjunction with my colleagues, Ibrahim and also Mike, I think when looking at the joint statement, it is a cause, it is a process, it is a cause in the right direction. And I'm so happy that you did mention, the universal obligation. It's very clear that there is a universal obligation for all parties to be a part of this, this global effort for the abolishment of nuclear weapons. And I do think that it's food for thought for us as we continue to move forward in the work that we're trying to do. So thank you very much.
So thanks for the panel. Does that mean there's an opportunity to amend the statement to bring in the universal obligation
Bill needs
as
to
opposed to
answer
just the
that.
NPT obligation?
It's not up to us.
I'm willingly being drawn into
He was sitting there.
I think what we have now in your comments were received and well noted, but I just want to say, and we'll be talking a little bit more about this later, but in the shaping of this joint declaration, we were really focused on a moral vision more so than the specifics and looking for broad moral vision than getting too far into the specificity of many of the conventions, fora, et cetera, for this, because we were looking to create and engage a wide range of faith communities. What we feel has been very significant about this is that this is the first time, to my knowledge, that U.S. faith communities have signed on to a statement regarding the humanitarian consequences of nuclear war. And so while we recognize this may not have everything for everyone, I've got 11 faith communities that have already agreed to this one, and I'm a little reluctant to go back and redo this. And I am similarly reluctant to make the negotiation of this statement too much the focal point of our conference. I think there are other issues that I'd like to see us engage in its stead. So I'll say that, and I'll sit down.
Thank you. Please.
Yeah. It's really, the timing of this conference is wonderful because at the same time that USTAR were planning this, unknown to us, we were planning a similar event at the United Nations, which I want to invite everybody to. So on April 30th, in the Trusteeship Council, during the time of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, PrepCom, the country of the Philippines and the Global Security Institute is hosting a meeting called Nuclear Weapons and the Moral Compass. And I'm pleased to say that the speakers will include the UN High Representative for Disarmament Affairs, Angela Kane, Bishop Swing of the United Religions Initiative, a large interfaith initiative, Bill Vendley from Religions for Peace, another interfaith initiative, Reverend Tyler Wigg Stevenson of the World Evangelical Alliance. So we're going to have the evangelicals coming out forcefully on the moral imperative. The Holy See, Archbishop Chulakot, who is the Pope's representative at the UN, Reverend Chung Ok Lee of Won Buddhism, Dr. Siddiqui, who is the head of the Sikh Council of North America, and Rabbi Peter Nobel. The only problem, I think it's a great panel we put together, great time, but the only problem is we don't have enough women. That's just part of the problem of the religions. But what we want to do, and I want to make a friendly suggestion, is reduce the issue to something that normal people can understand very, very simply, which is nuclear weapons are immoral, and for that reason they must be eliminated. And I would urge that if you could put that as a caption on your statement, that's what we're going to put forward. The most broad, simple statement possible. No flourish, just as a clear challenge. And I can't imagine arguing the other side, which would be nuclear weapons are moral sometimes, and therefore we need to keep them. That's a debate we win. And that's the debate that I think we need to crisply challenge. Make it as crisp, make it as simple, make it as sharp as possible. I think that's the lacuna in our debate. You couldn't manage slavery by reducing it by 30% or improving the conditions. It was an immoral institution. Apartheid was an immoral institution. Nuclear weapons are immoral. Therefore, they must be abolished. I would urge that could be a broad tent that would support and enliven all of the different avenues and efforts.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
That's good. That's wonderful.
Again, Mark Harrison with the United Methodist Church office. Just to that last point, Alan has a statement that was put out by a number of religious folk around the world, and I just think that's something that, and I don't know, I don't remember what it said, but I give you, genuflect to you for pulling so many of us together. I guess the last, and to the last speaker, my point was, in this country, there's a major faith group who's never part of these conversations. So at what point, as we as faith leaders, are going to actually engage them? And that is the Southern Baptist Church.
I think that's an important point, that we have to, I think part of what we hope to suggest as faith leaders is that approaching the humanitarian impact of nuclear weapons is really done, as I mentioned, not the impact will have international consequences that will impact the world, and so we need as broad of a coalition as possible to address it. And I think certainly events like this, where you have evangelical community represented, you have recent efforts, for example, by the World Council of Churches to have stereo advocacy from different nations around the world. All of those things help. But I think your point is well taken, that there are people not at the table. There is a lack of women at the table, and it's incumbent upon us to see that changes if we really take it seriously.
Just a quick thought about that, too. I think that it's one thing to try to bring together religions to address a particular issue together and to discuss it together. But there are other ways in which cooperation on an issue like this needs to be the fruit of a much longer process. And you need to have a kind of deeper basis of dialogue and of worshiping together among religious communities that doesn't start immediately with the goal of addressing a particular issue, but can lead to that over time. One thing that comes to mind that the Catholic Church has been doing has been promoting World Days of Prayer, starting at Assisi as a kind of global commitment to peace in a broad sense. And out of a process like that, it can be that you can reach out to groups that might otherwise not initially be included and bring them into that process.
Thank you. Maybe we'll stay on this side. Just we have a few more that were. Please.
Okay. Yes, my name is Steve Sawmill. I'm a member of the Jewish Islamic Dialogue Society, which is in the D.C. area. First and foremost, I want to thank the panel for your substance and your comments. It's excellent. SGI, I want to thank so much for this well-timed conference. To Mr. Ramey, you mentioned, you quoted the Ayatollah, the Iranian Ayatollah, about nuclear weapons, and I'd be very interested in your view of Iran's intentions toward nuclear energy and what your thoughts are. It's such an incredibly dangerous situation with Israel and Iran. Excuse me, and then U.S. intentions and our position, and what you might feel about that, and other panelists if they want to chip in.
I think, well, thank you. Shalom to you. I think that what is required in the Middle East is something like the Treaty of Pelindaba, that is a regional understanding of the need for the non-use and development of nuclear weapons, going back to the Declaration of Africa as a nuclear-free zone some years ago. I think that dialogue is probably not going to happen between extremes on either side, but I think that there are significant movements of moderation that may create such a dialogue. And I think that the framework for such a dialogue, not only about nuclear weapons, but also about the prosecution of a policy of nuclear power, which I think is the obverse side of the same dangerous coin, if you will, is necessary. And that's where I would advocate bringing together a Fukushima kind of framework within which that issue might be discussed. I know it's going to be hard. I know it will be with a lot of bumps in the process, but I think it's necessary. But most importantly, let the leaders of Iran and the leaders of the State of Israel declare that they will not use these weapons against each other, and they will seek to denuclearize the entire region, and leading to ultimately a peace and a mutual security.
I'll just mention that with Israel's position, is surrounded, as it were, by non-Jews that's a very difficult, and I'm not Jewish, by the way, so salam alaikum.
Okay, wa alaikum salam. Sorry for the assumption. Okay, but peace be with you anyway.
But
Okay.
the position is so precarious for Israel. There has to be some sympathy for their positions, yet their number of nuclear weapons is abysmal. So.
Okay.
We only have a few more minutes to wrap up, unfortunately, before lunch is scheduled at 1 o'clock. Why don't we take a group of, we have 4 questions left, and then we'll leave it for our panelists to collectively respond to those. Is that okay?
I'd like to hear from the sisters in the house.
Please, yeah. Well, if it's, yeah.
They always make more sense than guys do, actually. Really.
We'll get through all 4 of you. For sure, so.
Well, thank you. My name is Maya, and I'm representing Our Nuclear Future, which is a student division initiated movement in the SGI-USA. So, a lot of our students, they come from many, many different backgrounds, but because they believe in peace, they want to participate in this nuclear abolition. But in today's world, I think especially for young people, it's very difficult for us to try to make reality conform to our dreams. And so, it's difficult sometimes to believe really that nuclear abolition can happen. And so what are your suggestions for, youth who are engaging in these dialogues to, just as ordinary people who don't have much knowledge or don't necessarily come from like a peace studies or international studies background, to really engage in dialogue with other people who might not be, very aware of the threat of nuclear weapons? That's my question.
Thank you. Please, ma'am.
I'm Susan Meehan, a member of the Religious Society of Friends, Quakers, the one group that has been equal for women and men for many centuries. My question is this. Those in secular and religious power seem to feel we must await a nuclear disaster before becoming motivated to ban nuclear weaponry universally. Whose morality is served by this abstinence?
My name is Monica. Thanks. This is such a... Yes. My name is Monica McDuffie. I'm so glad to be here. I feel like we are all here. We're so privileged to be here. And I'm thinking of all of the folks. Well, my statement is, I'm wondering, how do we incorporate poor people in extreme poverty and the disenfranchised in this conversation? They don't have a voice and they have no real power or a place in the conversation about energy or nuclear weapons. That's one point. And the young woman who was sitting on the end here, who's now gone, mentioned about, or she might be in the audience somewhere, but she mentioned about education initiatives. And I was just wondering about what thoughts you might have, like some creative means to engaging everyday people on the topics. Thanks.
Hi, my name is Luis Morgante. I am an undergraduate at the University of Maryland and also part of the Nuclear Future group. And, it's so clear to me, hearing everybody speak and having these dialogues with people, that everyone here has just so much compassion, for human lives, that we're here to abolish nuclear weapons because we have compassion for each and every human life. And it's so frustrating to me that, we're not able to see the actual proof that we want, Not totally, but partially because of, the politics involved with going about achieving our goal. And, I'd like to know, just because we have such a clear universal goal, sorry, how we can use our faith, not just, Buddhists, not just Christians, but everyone can really come together to use their faith to, see actual proof in this goal that we're trying to achieve. Thank you.
maybe we can address very quickly summarize how to keep students inspired and motivated in light of the stark challenges they face, and the question of should we wait for a nuclear disaster and whose morality that serves, and incorporating the poor, and the last question on the use of faith. Are there any of those that particularly?
Yes. For the youth, I really want to say that the youth fundamentally is our future. And I think if we're very clear, regardless of what religious background we come from, that there's more youth or people who have never experienced the horror of war than those who have experienced it. And this ignorance alone, I think, is what can create a climate which we will repeat over and over again, the repetitions of the degradation of humanity. And so I think bringing further, misery on humanity if we don't get the point. So I think one of the ways is, I can honestly say that there was, for youth to be able to passionately fight for peace, understanding the struggles of those who have experienced it is a critical part of this process. And the SGI youth, wrote 2 books, Peace is Our Duty and Cries for Peace, over 56 volumes of experiences where the youth will be able to grasp, understand with their life, never forget, because our youth will be where we are today, 10, 20, 30 years from now. 2030 will come, no matter what. But I think our youth, being able to take the lead and never forgetting the reality of those experiences is critical. And the Quakers question, we have religious, the morality. I think that the answer is nobody's morality is served. Nobody benefits, from that kind of obstinate behavior. And I think that the poor and disenfranchised, I think, Dr. Ikeda said it most beautifully, that he talks about the need to increase resilience. Let's strengthen our human solidarity. If you think about all of us here today, how can we strengthen our human solidarity? Fostering a spirit of coexistence. Not that we just exist, but that we coexist. What does that look like? What does that feel like? And I think the foundation of anything has to be dialogue, especially the Southern Baptists you mentioned so beautifully. I agree. Dialogue has to take place to be able to create this coexistent kind of environment where dynamic change is taking place. And then finally, faith. The last question was the use of faith. I think, from a Buddhist perspective, the inner transformation of every single human being is critical. No matter what your religious belief is, when you take your faith and you use it as a means to be able to transform the human heart, the human spirit, Dr. Ikeda often talks about the heart is the most important thing. And I think Ibrahim, said it beautifully and talked about the heart, clearly knows that abolishment of nuclear weapons is nothing good about it. The human heart, no matter what color, race, background, poor, rich, whatever, you understand that. So the heart is the only thing, and the inner transformation of individual people in their faith, raising your consciousness, raising your voice, raising the ability to create action to transform humanity, I think is critical. Those are my responses.
Well, that was a great response and pretty comprehensive for all of them. I'll try to keep it very short. I think there is a generational challenge here that we haven't really acknowledged. Those that really grew up amidst the Cold War mentality versus young people today for whom this challenge seems a bit distant. And they see in the news, they're gradually reducing. Let's talk about climate change itself. Let's talk about poverty. Let's talk about other issues. And so there's a real challenge to keep young people committed and engaged around the issue. And I'm so glad to see some young faces here, because it is incumbent upon I would like to say us, but you, maybe me a few years ago, to take up that mantle and to continue to keep it at the forefront of the consciousness of your peers. I think there is, in that, the demographic shift and religious shift toward the rise of the nuns, not the nuns on the bus, but the nuns, the non-affiliated, is a challenge to this effort as well. And to see the particular burden then upon young people of faith to connect the conversation to our moral and religious traditions, I think is essential. So that conversation connects to the traditions that William raised, that I raised in the partnerships that the churches have had, that remains part of that conversation. And I think also, but there's an incredible opportunity there with the next generation, which is that they're incredibly, much more globally minded, that the national boundaries have much less meaning, and that the understanding of the mutual threats that we face is much clearer for people. There's much less of an us and them. And so I think the point about raising up bringing the face back into the conversation, whether that's the Marshallese, whether that's around Fukushima, or certainly the bombings of Japan. Bringing that face back, I think, is what is needed, and because of that, I would argue for an Asia pivot, not only in our foreign policy but in the peace movement as well.
2 words: radical democracy. My generation challenged and ultimately dismantled legal segregation and apartheid in the United States. I'm old enough to remember going to segregated schools. I'm young enough to remember what it was like to desegregate the schools and ultimately create a different paradigm for the education of African American and other people of color in the United States. But I think that young people are pushing for radical transformation, not always within the boundaries of organizations and movements and faith structures that we envision, but that we need to be encouraging and empowering in allowing young people to just take it and run. And I think that SGI has done a brilliant job of doing that. Other traditions are struggling with it, but maybe making relative progress in some ways, maybe challenges in others. But I do think that young people are central to the survival of this planet and transformation of faith in a living witness to all of us.
Just a couple of thoughts. First, in response to Monica's point about how to involve, especially the marginalized in society in these issues, I think that's a significant problem, because I think that nuclear weapons disempower us in some very deep and compelling ways. And the case that I made was that when we address a problem like the immorality of nuclear weapons, we always have to look at it in the broader context of the economic issues and the social issues that they're bound up with. So there has to be more of a comprehensive approach that links empowering people and enabling people to participate in democracy and democratic processes with this overall goal of attacking nuclear weapons. I run a peace studies program. I'm a peace educator, so I wrestle with some of these problems about how to reach out to students, how to activate students on an ongoing basis. One thing that I can say is that there are new possibilities that are emerging with information technologies and with media that can be useful. And it might even, the problem that you mentioned of how to break through the mindset of policymakers that they only need to react when a disaster happens. Sometimes a movie or some kind of visceral quasi-experience of disaster, I think of Hotel Rwanda, for example, as a movie, can make a difference there. Lastly, just a quick word about the project of bringing faith communities together, of energizing faith to address these issues. It's a wonderful synergy that we have here in this room, but I hate to think that we have simply gathered together a group of like-minded people who are involved in their own project and might not be able to build up the boundaries and alliances with other people from non-faith-based communities. I think I'm concerned with this, especially with the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church, churches, religious communities always have to have a mind with building bridges with non-believers or with the secularly minded, because ultimately the issues about nuclear weapons, for example, are moral issues that affect us all, irrespective of religious belief.
Great. Well, with that, I want to thank the four panelists for this very rich, insightful discussion.